Hi all. This time we will be talking about race and ethnicity. First we will define race and ethnicity, and then we will talk about what exactly we mean by racism, prejudice, and discrimination. These are all terms that unfortunately our society really blends together. So by understanding these terms, we can understand the problem a lot more. So when we talk about race, we are talking about a socially defined category that is based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Examples of different races include Latino, African American or Black, and white or Caucasian. And of course, there are other races as well. But primarily, when we talk about race, we are talking about those physical categories that we put other people in that are largely based off skin tone, hair texture, facial appearance, those sorts of things, physical differences between people. However, those physical differences and how they're clustered are socially defined. There are other societies that cluster people and determine races differently than our own, even though the people living in those society might be within a racial category that we would classify as being different. Hopefully that will be a little clearer when we get through the rest of the lecture. Ethnicity then is socially defined. It is a category based on common language, religion, nationality, history, or other cultural factors. So ethnicity is based on cultural factors. So here are some examples. And I refer to the Pennsylvania Dutch because I myself am of Pennsylvania Dutch descent. The Pennsylvania Dutch, we are descendants of German people who came to the United States in the late 1700s and early 1800s. We were primarily farmers during that era. There are, we have our own symbols, we have our own sets of recipes and those sort of things. We have common cultural understandings. We are often mistaken for the Amish. I in no way really appear Amish, but the term Pennsylvania Dutch is sometimes mistakenly used to mean Amish, but we're not the same people. Similarly, yeah, so that's good. Somali people from Africa. That is also an example of ethnicity. There's a large collection of Somali people living here in Columbus, in my city. Irish people are also an example of an ethnicity, and Mexican people are an ethnicity. Usually, people who are ethnically Mexican are also racially Latino, but not always. Sociologists see race and ethnicity as social constructions mainly because race is not based on biology. I said it was based on physical characteristics, but while those physical characteristics are biological, like your skin tone, your eye color, etc., how we categorize those characteristics, that is based on social factors. So, and those social factors shift over time. So there was a time in the United States when people of what we now classify as Arabic descent could have been classified as white. There it was a time when, um, for example, Irish people in the late 1800s were under certain classifications classified as black. It's thought that that may be where the term black Irish came from. But if you don't have much experience, I don't think there are many Irish people in New Mexico. I could be wrong. And these racial categories never had firm boundaries. And there are a number of reasons for that, but it's largely because it's of social construct reasons. And this distinction between race and ethnicity and not confusing race and ethnicity is very important, primarily because ethnicity can be displayed or hidden, but race is very difficult to mask. There is a history of people trying to mask their race in the United States, particularly black people attempting to mask their race during eras of heavy discrimination. But ethnicity, you have a little bit more leeway because ethnicity is based on social factors. I don't have to tell you about my Pennsylvania Dutch background. If I didn't tell you anything about that, I just appeared to be, your run-of-the-mill white dude. Oh, sorry about that. So ethnicity comes in two forms: symbolic ethnicity and situational ethnicity. Symbolic ethnicity is an ethnic identity that is only relevant on specific occasions and does not significantly impact everyday life. Sorry about that typo in everyday. That zero shouldn't be there. You could call symbolic ethnicity holiday ethnicity. So people that pretend, well, they don't pretend, but they don't ever talk about their Irish heritage except on St. Patrick's Day. That's an example of symbolic ethnicity. Or people that talk about Mexican heritage unless they bring it up on Cinco de Mayo, right? And chances are, if they're bringing it up on Cinco de Mayo, they're probably not Mexican anyway. That is symbolic ethnicity. Situational ethnicity, then, is the use of an ethnic identity that can either be displayed or concealed depending on its usefulness in a given situation. So I'll use myself as an example again. If I went into another academic's office and I saw they had one of our Pennsylvania Dutch hex symbols, hex signs, you can look that up on Google if you really need a visual. That is a symbol of my Pennsylvania Dutch heritage. So if I saw that displayed in somebody's office, I could say, "Oh, are you Pennsylvania Dutch?" Because I would recognize that particular symbol as a symbol that there wouldn't be much of a reason for that person to have that in their office if they had. And there are many examples of situational ethnicity. Here are two examples of symbolic ethnicity. We have a picture of presumably Irish people dyeing, I think that's the Chicago River green for St. Patrick's Day. And we have children dressed up in traditional or thought to be traditional Mexican garb. I don't know the reason for that. Again, might be Cinco de Mayo, might be something else. Main reason I keep that there is because I love the little boys wearing mustaches. I just think that's hilarious. Let's talk about demographics. So, in the United States, nationwide, 65% of our population is white. 15.8 or just under 16% is Hispanic or Latino. 12.1% is African American. 4% is Asian. 1.8% of our population identifies as being of two or more races or mixed race. 0.6% identify as being American Indian or Alaskan Native, and 0.1% identify as being Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. Let's see. Now, this varies from region to region how closely this resonates. I teach in the center of a city in Ohio, and a lot of my students said, this doesn't represent my lived experience. There are way more black people than that in my world. Or if I went back to my hometown and say, that doesn't represent our lived experience, everyone is white. There are only a very small portion of the population that are non-white. And I presume in your part of the world, you would probably report that there are way more Latinos in my part of the world than only 16%. Well, that has to do with the region of the world you're in. In the Southwest, there are a whole lot more Latinos than there are in my part of the world. And that really has an impact, because when we talk about things like the 2016 presidential election and how most people who weren't white did not vote for Donald Trump. Well, if you live in a world, in a region where there are fewer white people, it can be hard to understand how that presidential election went down. but if you understand the national demographics, it can be a little bit easier, um, even as difficult as that could be to accept. A minority group, then, in sociological terms, we're not necessarily talking about numbers, is a social group that is systematically denied access to power and access to resources available to the dominant group in society. Just like I said, it doesn't have anything to do with numbers of people. So, for example, in South Africa during apartheid, blacks made up 80% of the population, even though they were held in a power situation such as they were a minority group within their own country. Only about 15% of the population was white, but the white people controlled almost everything, all the factories, all the government positions in South Africa. So for that reason, even though they were 80% of the population, black people were a minority in South Africa during that era. Racism, then, we will define as a set of beliefs about the superiority of one racial or ethnic group over others. And racism is often used to justify inequality. This is often pointed to when we talk about those disparities between white people and black people in the prison system. Well, one racist explanation for that is, well, black people are more prone to committing crimes than white people. So therefore, that's how we justify more black people proportionately being in jail than white people. And the social science shows that's clearly not the case. Now, you may be saying to yourself, if you're particularly astute, does, does ethnicity also classify under racism? Yes, it's not. It's an overly broad term probably, but when we talk about justifying inequality against ethnic groups too, we are also, we call that racism. So that would be something like discriminating against Catholics or discriminating against Jews. That would be an example of, under this category, racism. It could also be ethnocentrism or xenophobia. There are a lot of terms that mean roughly the same thing. It depends how nitpicky you get. Now, prejudice is different from discrimination. Prejudice is a thought process, is an idea about the characteristics of a given group. And prejudice is applied to all members of that group and is unlikely to change regardless of evidence against it. So if you have attitudes against a group of people and you think everyone in that group is, say, lazy, you think all African Americans are lazy, and then you happen to meet a black person that isn't lazy, you would possibly say something like, well, Jerry, quote, he's one of the good ones, right? That is a justification for still thinking your racist thoughts, but encountering Jerry, who's clearly not lazy, and still being racist. Never said this stuff was logical. Discrimination, then, is an action. Discrimination is unequal treatment of individuals because of their social group. And discrimination is usually motivated by prejudice. So if you thought all black people are lazy and you then didn't give Jerry a job because he is black, then not giving him that job would be discriminatory. But if you thought that all black people are lazy, you have that prejudice against Jerry's group, but you still do hire Jerry, well, in that instance at least, you are not being discriminatory, but you are still prejudiced. And because you're prejudiced against a specific group, that prejudice would be rooted in racism. I hope that makes sense. I think it does. Now, discrimination takes two forms. Individual discrimination and institutional discrimination. Individual discrimination is discrimination carried out by one person against another. So your landlord doesn't rent to you because you're black, and usually in that case people don't give that reason because there are laws against such things. But If one person discriminates against another person, that is individual discrimination. Institutional discrimination, then, is a systematic discrimination carried out by social institutions, so political groups, economic groups, educational groups, that affect all members of a group that come in contact with it. So an example of institutional discrimination would be something like the condo association has rules against renting to African Americans. Now, this type of discrimination is now illegal, but it still does happen, even though it's usually unintentional or subtle. An example of that, there have been criticisms of getting into college tests like the SATs and the ACTs, that they're unintentionally biased toward white people, so that white people do better, and they're biased against non-white people, particularly non-native English speakers. So if you're a non-native English speaker, even if you're absolutely fluent, but you didn't actually grow up with it from when you were very young, you might miss the nuance in certain sentences. You might not know a certain vocabulary. So if I ask you a baseball metaphor, you might not necessarily get it, or a football metaphor, or anything. You might not necessarily get it because you don't have that cultural knowledge, and that cultural knowledge should not dictate whether you get into college or not, because usually people don't major in baseball. That's an example of institutional discrimination. That could take the form of maybe a different type of discrimination. Let's talk about discrimination against handicapped people. If you're in some sort of wheelchair or device like that, and there is no ramp to get into the building, then that is an example of institutional discrimination to keep you from being able to either use that service or get a job there. That's also institutional discrimination. Okay, that's it for this portion. We have one more portion for this week, but I hope you watch it soon.